All right, welcome everyone. I am Liz. I am one of the reference librarians at the Derry Public Library, and I'm one of the resident film cinephiles, film aficionados, and I would like to welcome you to my program on women in film. I'm just gonna do full screen. There we go. Oh. Sorry, again, the fun of technical difficulties. So we're here to talk about women directors throughout cinema history. So full disclosure, as I was doing this project, I realized this really should have been two programs because I think the women of the silent era and early Hollywood alone are enough to warrant a program, but I'm here. It's one program. I couldn't schedule another night. So I guess my hubris got the better of me. Because of that, I'm not going to be able to spend too much time on any one person or any one slide. So if you have any questions about a particular woman that I mention or recommendations, feel free to email me at lizar@derrypl.org. Also, for the focus of this is mainly, I would say, US centric. I did try to pull from women all around the globe, but my criteria for that was women who have made films that kind of made a splash in the United States. Obviously, the world is full of amazing, talented female directors that I cannot cover here. In fact, to cover like women in France, women in Germany, I'd have to have, again, a whole separate program. But we're going to get started. I'm just going to share the screen. All right, so welcome to Women Filmmakers. Also, today is International Women's Day, so happy International Women's Day. And I figure, like, what better day to talk about women's contribution to film than International Women's Day during International Women's History Month. I was always under the impression when I was younger that women came to cinema a little bit later in the game due to your standard reasons of gatekeeping, sexism, what have you. However, thankfully I was wrong in that. I learned that a few years ago. And actually in the past couple of years, a lot of the pioneers of women in cinema, particularly women of the silent era, have gotten a lot more attention. And with that, we're going to start with Alice Guy Blasch, the first woman filmmaker, or potentially, as I say, Todd, could you admit Diane? Thank you. All right, Alice Guy Blasch. So she is the first woman filmmaker. I should say the first recorded woman filmmaker. Potentially there might have been someone else. We can't be sure, but as of right now, all of the, sorry, one moment. Okay, I'm not sure. Sorry, I'm not sure why this isn't working. Okay. All right, sorry about that. All right, so Alice Guy Blasch is the first woman filmmaker. So her first film, or the first film made by any woman, was called The Fairy and the Cabbages, and that was made in 1896. So we also have to keep in mind, a lot of her films were not full-length feature productions. They were anywhere from a minute to 30 minutes. Nowadays, they would be classified as shorts. But in terms of the first woman to pick up a camera direct to film, Alice Guy Blasch was the woman. She also liked to shoot on location. I mean, back in the early days of film, there weren't always studios. She did make her own production company in 1910. And she also liked to make a lot of films starring women. A lot of her movies were whimsical, they were comedic, but they were also action oriented. The films that have been discovered are really fun. And if you can find them, some of them are on YouTube, they're really neat to watch. She made films up until 1920. Her final, again, known film is Tarnished Reputations, and that is more of a full-length feature. But where she really excelled were her short productions. So again, we to anyone who says like, oh, women haven't been in film that long, we have been there since the beginning of cinema. So as I mentioned a little early on, women of the silent era, there were a lot of women making films at the time. There were a lot of women making films during the silent era. So why is that? There was a great article in The Atlantic, and basically as they summed it up was, quote, during the silent era, cinema was generally viewed as a fringe medium, an eccentric hobby, not something meant to last or make any real money. In such a context, and given that a lot of the men were away fighting World War I during this period, women had the space and the freedom to express themselves through this new art form. So yes, film was seen as more of a hobby, a fun thing to do, not a big, important piece of the art canon. And unfortunately, once it became a part of the art canon, that is where the gatekeeping came in. But there were a lot of women who made silent features. A lot of them were like 45 minutes to an hour. A feature-length film now, we think 90 minutes or more. Feature length back then was a lot shorter. So we actually had the first Chinese woman to direct a film in 1916 with Marion E. Wong, and that was called The Curse of Kwangguan, When the Far East Mingles with the West. Again, a title that may not have aged very well. Unfortunately, while she acted in a lot of films, her foray into directing wasn't a box office hit, and that was something she didn't really like to speak of as she got older. We also had movies like Motherhood, Life's Greatest Miracle, and Dorothy Davenport, who did The Red Kimono. And far from being kind of puffy, fluffy pictures, a lot of women's films of the silent era tackled tough issues. Prostitution was discussed, birth control was discussed, abortion was discussed. And as if you know anything about the early 1900s and people like Emma Goldman and Margaret Sanger, that was stuff that was being talked about as as an issue and what women can have access to. So these women decided to comment on it and make their art about it, which is something we still see today. But the biggest woman of the silent era was Lois Weber. So she was the leading female director in early Hollywood, and she was part of a husband and wife team, but she was really the more dominant person in that partnership. She was the one who really dealt with the studios and really called the shots on set. And her 1914 film, The Merchant of Venice, was the first American feature directed by a woman. And so just for further terminology, when I say feature, I mean feature-length film. And like a lot of the other women of the silent era, she made films that dealt with drugs, poverty, abortion, and contraception. She actually had a film called Where Are My Children that dealt with abortion and contraception. And there was a follow-up film that actually dealt with, it's seen as a sequel. It deals with with a couple becoming birth control advocates. So interesting woman. Unfortunately, she didn't make a lot of films going into the 30s. She kind of petered out a bit. She did transition to a screenwriting position for a while, but again, as the Hollywood gatekeeping system started to push women out, she got less and less opportunities. And her final film was White Heat in 1934. But there was someone there to kind of step in as the leading female director in Hollywood. And in this case, the only woman director in Hollywood for at least a decade, and that's Dorothy Arzner. So she was someone very interested in film, and like a lot of women we're going to see in this, kind of got their start from the bottom. So she started typing scripts. She worked as an editor, and she caught the eye of people that she worked with and was able to get a first feature, and that was Fashions for Women in 1927. And that was a success. And the subsequent films that she directed for Paramount, which were The 10 Modern Commandments, Get Your Man, and Manhattan Cocktail, they were all successes as well. So that got her a lot of leverage with the studio. And in return, she got a lot of freedom. And she actually said, she's like, in one of her, it wasn't a biography, but an interview, but she said that she got, basically along the lines of she never felt that she got any less freedom or was treated differently as a woman. And she said, if anything, the suits at Paramount were like, you're making us money, we'll give you what you want. So, and she did transition from the silent era to the talkie era with The Wild Party. And she directed until 1943 with First Comes Courage. But when she retired, she was the only woman who directed in Hollywood. And for a while, there were literally no women directing in Hollywood. And then Ida Lupita comes along in the late 40s. She might look familiar because she was also an actress, and her name might sound familiar if you are a fan of The Twilight Zone. She is actually the only woman to have ever directed an episode of Rod Serling's original series, and one of the most iconic episodes, which is season 5's The Mask. So she also kind of has her place as a woman in like horror sci-fi. In terms of a groundbreaker there. So her first feature was Never Fear in 1949. And like Louise Weber, like the women of the silent era, she liked to deal with taboo topics. One of her films earlier films dealt with an unwed mother dealing with, being an unwed mother. Not something we would consider that out of the blue now, but keep in mind, late 40s, early 50s, that was still a really big taboo. And was the second woman admitted to the Directors Guild of America. If you haven't seen any of her movies, probably the easiest one to find, I know it was available for free on stuff like Crackle for a while, is The Hitchhiker, and it's also considered to be her masterpiece. So I would say as of right now, we're seeing a lot of women that don't work, they didn't work in, say, romantic comedies. They didn't work in fluff, which is where a lot of people will unfairly put women's features. They like to tackle real issues, and they like to deal with issues that affected women. In many cases, stuff that they had probably dealt with in their lives in some way, shape, or form, or knew someone who had dealt with it. So yeah, I would actually really recommend looking up Ida Lupina stuff, or just her story in general. Like, she is an incredibly interesting woman. So a few other pioneers of film. Being a fan of Japanese cinema, I did want to highlight Tazuko Sakane. She was the first woman to direct a feature in Japan, New Clothing, in 1936. She actually was Kenji Mizoguchi's assistant. If you're a fan of Japanese cinema, he's a very big name in terms of classics. Her only film, though, was New Clothing was her only film. She did direct other features, which were mainly educational and pseudo-propaganda-ish pieces. Speaking of someone who did that, we'll get to that in a few slides. Latte Reininger, I'm going to apologize in advance for mangling some of these names. She is an animation pioneer, and she pioneered silhouette animation. And if you have heard her name in passing, she's usually brought up as one of the mothers of animation who didn't work for Disney, which, as a side note, I would highly recommend the book Queens of Animation, which is about the women who worked for Disney in the early ages. But Lottie was someone who worked as an animator. She directed one of the first animated feature films in 1926. And her work as an animator actually ended up tangentially saving her life. She and her husband were involved with left-wing politics, and when the Reich started to rise, left-wingers were some of the first people who were really rounded up. So they fled Germany in 1933, and going to other countries and working on projects was how they kind of were able to stay in one place for a time, because they weren't able to immigrate anywhere. But as long as they were working on a project, they're like, they had the equivalent of a work visa. And Tressie Souders is the first Black woman to direct a feature. Unfortunately, her feature, which was called A Woman's Error, which was directed in 1922, is, I don't want to say lost to time, because there are film reels being found to this day. So potentially it's still out there, but no print has been located at this point. But in terms of records, she is the first Black woman to direct a feature film. There were Black women directing shorts in the silent era, but she is the first one to direct a feature-length film. There were also women working outside of the Hollywood system while Dorothy Arzner was working, while Ida Lupino was working. So these were women who did more of the experimental avant-garde stuff. Maya Deren, Marie Menken, and Shirley Clark. Shirley Clark is actually, if you're a fan of independent cinema, Shirley Clark is considered one of the pioneers of that. Mainly her stuff was documentary focused, but the idea of doing something outside of the studio system, she really helped pioneer that. And Maya Deren, if you were a fan of like artistic avant-garde filmmaking, Meshes of the Afternoon is considered one of the most influential and important experimental films ever made. And it just goes to show that even if the gatekeeping in effect kept a lot of women from making films on a soundstage in Hollywood, it did not keep them from picking up a camera and making art. So I kind of hinted at this a little earlier, but there is a name that comes up when people think of women filmmakers that has been absent as of now, and that is due to her very controversial legacy, to put it lightly, and that is Lenny Riefenstahl. Lenny Riefenstahl, I think as of now, for a while she was in the cinematic canon as a female filmmaker with a very, again, controversial past, but I think now her place in film history is mainly as a Nazi propagandist, which I think is what she deserves. So she is someone who was a well-known filmmaker in Germany at the time, and she was, even people who criticize her will say, a technically talented filmmaker, and no one is criticizing her technique. It is what she did with it. Her most famous film is Triumph of the Will, which is one of the many things credited with help giving rise and popularity to Adolf Hitler. And she continued to work with him for other features, the other big one being Olympia, which was the film of the Olympics. She always maintained that she was politically naive. She didn't see any of this coming. She had no idea what this would become. I don't want to call foul on that. However, there were other German filmmakers at the time who I'm sure she was in the same circle, who had an idea of what was coming. Again, Latte Reininger left in 1933. More famously, Fritz Lang, who directed M in Metropolis, left Germany and actually left his wife behind because she was on the side of the Reich. He left very early on because he, again, didn't see this ending well. So she was actually detained at the end of the war by the Allies, by the British specifically. And she just claimed she wasn't political, which that's interesting. Interesting way to put it. And she would maintain that throughout her life. Ultimately her film career did suffer after this. She never, I think, made another movie, and her name is pretty much now ultimately associated with the Reich. But she just maintained that she was politically naive throughout her life. She's never fully apologized for what she did. I think a lot of people would just appreciate it, even if she said, I truly didn't know, but I apologize. But she's never really even done that. If anything, she just didn't speak to people afterwards. The most we'll probably ever have of her admitting any kind of a hand in the Reich is this quote from a BBC interview, which was a few years before she died. She said, quote, "I was one of the millions who thought Hitler had all the answers. We saw only the good things and we didn't know bad things were to come." And at the end of the day, she died in her sleep at 101, which is something millions of people at that time never had a chance to do. But with that, we're going to move on to much less problematic pioneers in women's cinema. And that, I don't think there's any other better place to start than with Agnes Varda, who actually only passed away, I think, 2 years ago. I just kind of look at a lot of the women in the silent era who they worked up to a point, but they still ultimately hit roadblocks. I just look at it as like, oh, you all walked so Agnes and all these girls could run. Agnes is considered one of the founders of French New Wave, one of the most influential filmmakers of all time. You ask a lot of filmmakers, regardless of their gender, Agnes Varda is consistently named as an inspiration. And she has had a successful career that has spanned from the 50s up until her death in 2019. Cleo 5 to 7 is the film that put her on the map. That was in 1961. We actually watched that in my film class to look at jump cut techniques. And again, that was a bold editing technique at the time. And Cleo 5 to 7 was also groundbreaking because it was an existential film, which, France had done, European films had done existentialism, but it was from a woman's perspective. It's about a model who gets news that she might potentially have a terminal disease. And it's just her afternoon processing that possibility. And her films continued to cover women's perspective. There is a wonderful film, if you've never seen it, called One Sings and the Other Doesn't. It is a feminist musical film. There's a great movie called Vagabond, which just takes the point of view of a woman who is a drifter. It never, moralizes about her way of life. It just shows it as is. And her final film was in 2017. So she worked pretty much up until her death. She just left behind a wonderful, joyous body of work. And it's just a nice palate cleanser after having to talk about Lenny Riefenstahl. Up next, Leita Mueller, an Italian filmmaker and the woman who has the honor of being the first woman nominated for directing an Oscar. That was for 1977. The Oscars had been around for roughly 50 years at that point. Although when you take into account how, gatekeeping in Hollywood, it's a little understandable how it took them until 1977. So she, like a lot of women, had a lot of different roles. So like Ida Lupina, she was an actress. Like Dorothy Arzner, she was a writer. She was also a puppeteer. She worked as an assistant to Federico Fellini, director of 8½. So she made her film debut in 1963 with The Lizards, and her film Seven Beauties, which is also considered to be her masterpiece, is the film that got her nominated for an Oscar. So where a lot of these women will cover sexual politics, Lena likes to do it from more of a comedic angle rather than a serious angle. And still, also, she is still with us. She is still making films. It is just nice to see that some of these pioneers are still working. So we're moving on to another founding member of the French New Wave, and another huge influence on filmmakers that are still working today was Chantal Ackerman. So a good way to describe her style is that it is stripped down. It's no frills. There's not a lot of, pretty window dressing, but it is also very precise. Her opus, her masterpiece, Jean Dillman, it is 3.5 hours long, but you watch that film, every single thing, right down to a glass on the table, it is there for a reason. And specifically for Jean Dillman, it's to show the daily life of a housewife and just how her routine is similar. And so on day 3, when you start to notice some changes where she slips in the routine, it's all the more impactful. Filmmakers like Sofia Coppola or Kelly Reichardt and Celine Sciamma have cited her as an influence. Unfortunately, she is no longer with us. She passed away in 2015. I believe she actually took her own life. Her final film is No Home Movie. She actually made a number of documentaries about her and her mother. She was incredibly close to her mom. It's sad she's no longer with us, but the good thing about art is art endures after you're gone. So we're moving to the United States with Barbara Loden. The name might sound familiar even if you haven't heard of her only feature. So she was in Splendor in the Grass. She worked on Broadway. She won a Tony for After the Fall, in which she portrayed Marilyn Monroe kind of archetype. And she was married to Elia Kazan. She made only one film in her life, and that was Wanda. And it was a film that was kind of, like a lot of these pictures, kind of lost to time for a while. But it was recently re-released by the Criterion Collection. I think Kino Lorber did a film special screenings of it, and it's a considered staple of now American independent cinema, because she actually tried to shop it around to other people to direct it. She wrote it. No one else would, so she goes, fine, I will do it myself. And Wanda's an interesting movie. I said Chantal Ackerman is no frills, but you want a really stripped down film. Wanda, it takes place in coal mining country. It's about a woman who just has no real direction in her life, and it's an incredibly sad and impactful film, because it almost looks like it's a woman having an existential crisis. um but it is now finally available, thankfully, but for a while it was not, and with its re-release it's been celebrated as kind of hidden treasure of new American cinema. The Criterion Collection does have it if you want to check it out. I think it might also be on the Criterion channel. Unfortunately, she passed away in 1980 of breast cancer, so she only left one film, but it left a big impact and in some ways opened doors for a lot of other women in the United States. So speaking of women who open doors, Elaine May. This is another name that is probably very familiar because she has a career outside of directing. She got her start with Comedy Players. She worked with the Compass Players, and she was a part of the comedy team with Mike Nichols. I believe it was called Nichols and May. So her debut was in 1971, A New Leaf, which she also wrote and starred in. And that also stars Walter Matthau, who I just consider to be a treasure. Her follow-up, The Heartbreak Kid, was well received, but unfortunately she started to run into trouble when she made Mickey and Nicky. So that went over time and over budget, and the studio kind of took control away from her. And that was another film that for a while was kind of considered lost, and it's been rediscovered again, thanks to the Criterion Collection. And that's kind of been like, her cut is being hailed as like an unsung masterpiece. And that was such a bad experience. She did not write and direct again until Ishtar. And the reason she did Ishtar was because Warren Beatty was a fan of her and was like, oh, I want you to make this movie with me. And that film, if you are a fan of film, Ishtar is a punchline. It is recently having a kind of a revision, not a revision, but people are looking at it with a different set of eyes and asking, is it really that bad? I have actually not seen Ishtar, mainly because I was always warned away from it. But that was a film so bad, it ruined her career. And she is still yet to direct another movie. She has stayed active in the stage, and she actually won a Tony Award, I think, a year or two ago. But it's when you look at other directors who are men who will have films that are like box office bombs, usually, with a few exceptions, they will get another chance to direct a film. Francis Ford Coppola had a string of flops in the 1980s, and he still went on to make films into the 90s. Whereas Elaine May had one bad movie, and that was it. It killed her career. And this is something we're going to unfortunately kind of see as we go forward, is women get put in director jail a lot easier than guys do. So moving back to France with Katherine Brelia, she's an interesting director. A lot of these directors I can recommend at least one film. I'm not sure if I can do that for Katherine Brelia. Her films are interesting. They are audacious. They are incredibly in your face, but they are also difficult to watch. You can tell by the first bullet point, she deals with sex and sexual politics in a very frank way. And she also deals with sex and violence a lot. Her film Fat Girl, which was 2001, or also called Oh My Sister, it was initially banned in Ontario due to its look at teen sexuality and its violent content. And her debut was in 1976, called A Real Young Girl, which is about a teenage girl's sexual awakening. It was banned in France and not released until 1999. She's an interesting filmmaker, and the frankness with which she approaches the subject and the ways in which she'll depict brutalities inflicted upon women is obviously influential. But it does not mean she is the easiest filmmaker to watch. Again, I think the one I'd have to recommend might be just the Abuse of Weakness. I think that might be her easiest entry point, and that's also her most recent film. So moving back to America with Claudia Weil, she only directed 2 features, and her debut was Girlfriends in 1978. So this might not seem like something incredibly influential, but the movie Girlfriends kind of paved the way for a lot of chick flicks or friendship flicks. I would say a movie like, Bridesmaids, or any movie where it's not about women in romance, but it's literally about the women and their friendships with each other. Girlfriends really paved the way for that. And she said she did it because she didn't feel like she was seeing herself or her friends on screen. She also co-directed a documentary with Shirley MacLaine called The Other Half of the Sky. And rather than getting her start in LA, she started in New York. She also directed a film with Jill Clyburn called It's My Turn. And after that, she mostly focused on television directing. But Girlfriends can be seen as kind of the starting point for a lot of the like lady buddy comedies that we see. Moving on to a name I think a lot more people are familiar with is Jillian Armstrong. If you are a fan of the 1994 Little Women, you know that name. So she is an Australian filmmaker, and she came out of the like Oz boom of the 70s and 80s. If you're not familiar with that, the early 70s to the early 80s was when Australian cinema was starting to be seen by the rest of the world. You had Walkabout, you had Picnic at Hanging Rock, you had Mad Max. The world was starting to notice, oh, Aussie cinema is pretty cool. And she was the female filmmaker who really broke out of that with 1979's My Brilliant Career, which was also launched the career of the amazing Judy Davis, an actress that I love. Her follow-up Starstruck is also wonderful. High Tide is great. Mrs. Soffel, more high profile for who it starred, which was Mel Gibson, again, a rising star at the time, and Diane Keaton, who was already a superstar. And she is someone who pretty much consistently through the decades has had a high profile career. Again, 1994 Little Women made her a classic for a lot of millennial women. And she has, like, I think a lot of directors, I've seen a lot of women kind of going more towards television than film, but she has stayed busy and stayed working. And a nice little addendum to the Little Women thing is she publicly supported Greta Gerwig and went to go see her movie and said it was wonderful. I like that she didn't show any like, that's my turf, get off of it. But again, if you've never seen My Brilliant Career, especially her 80s work, highly recommend it. So moving on to someone you might not be familiar with, Lizzie Borden. That is not her birth name. She chose that name. She is an independent filmmaker who, rather than going the more starkness that Katherine Brelia does with sexuality and sexual politics, she chooses to go not a softer route, but definitely not as a traumatic a route. So her debut was Born in Flames, which, if you're a fan of Catherine Bigelow, actually features her in an acting role. And that was kind of the guerrilla style independent filmmaking. I believe when that film came out, it was actually trashed by some people as a waste of MacArthur grant money. I think it's an interesting film. It has its pieces in like feminist film history. But I find her follow-up film, Working Girls, to be, I think, more interesting because it's something we still don't see a lot in modern film, which is her depiction of sex workers. Usually, sex workers in film are either stock characters that we see for 5 seconds, or they're Fantine in Les Miserables. Whereas her film depicts, it's frank, it's matter of fact, it's not exoticizing it, nor is it making it to be like a traumatic last ditch decision for these people. In some cases, the women in the film have their own agency over their profession. And recently, her documentary Regrouping has been kind of rediscovered, mainly because someone found a print of it. Unfortunately, once she got mainstream Hollywood recognition, that was when her career didn't work well. She has her own story of Harvey Weinstein. Thankfully, it's not a traumatic story, but it's one of him not trusting her instincts. And her Hollywood career really fizzled out, and she unfortunately became known as like someone who could do erotic films. She told a story in an interview where she wanted to direct television. She's like, "Oh, can I get an episode of NYPD Blue?" And they're like, "No, we can give you Baywatch." And she's just like, "I'm not doing that." But she is still someone who is around and, offering interviews and offering advice in the film community and showing a lot of support and solidarity with new filmmakers. So we're going to I bunch some of the 80s ladies, as I like to call them, together because some of these directors have somewhat similar trajectories. So the 80s ladies of the indie scene, aside from Lizzie Borden, we have Penelope Spherus, who directed the documentary The Decline of Western Civilization and the punk film Suburbia. She and Susan Seidelman definitely had the more guerrilla approach to it. When I say guerrilla, there's no formal set. There's not really a formal crew. It's people with whatever gear they have and cameras shooting and getting what they can. Usually it's edited on the fly. It's not the squeaky clean Hollywood production. It's also probably one step below indie films in terms of production quality, but they still have an impact. Decline of Western Civilization is considered one of the best music documentaries ever made, and Suburbia has a cult following. Penelope Spherus eventually did go on to make more high-profile films, directing Wayne's World, and giving us that big Bohemian Rhapsody sequence. And Susan Seidelman directed Smithereens, which recently got a re-release on Blu-ray, but is more well-known for Desperately Seeking Susan. And she still directs television, whereas Spherus still does a lot of film history work and documentaries. And going on to the 80s ladies of comedy, two names you probably know. Amy Heckerling gave us two just teen classics with Fast Times at Ridgemont High and Clueless. And one of the things I love about those films, especially Fast Times, is how much she respects the teenagers. And if you compare them to other teen films at the time that came out, especially stuff like Porky's, just the amount of care that she has for her fictional subjects versus those films, it's night and day. But still, even directing, two very well received films, she still got in director jail twice. So for National Lampoon's European Vacation, which was not well received, she's like, I went to director jail for 4 years before doing Look Who's Talking. And then in the early aughts, she made a film called Loser, which didn't do well. And unfortunately, she's never completely recovered from that. I mean, she's still famous for the films that she's given us, but again, it's very sad where you look at some of these women where one bad film can just undo everything they had. Also, a fun anecdote she gave from an interview, she made a film, I Could Never Be Your Woman, which starred Michelle Pfeiffer, passed on by Paramount because they felt a movie about a woman over 40 wouldn't sell. I wasn't aware that women over 40 never went to films, but okay, Paramount execs. And Martha Coolidge gave us Valley Girl and Real Genius. Martha Coolidge was also, I think she is the person who would be responsible for breaking out Nicolas Cage, because she was the one who chose him for the male lead in Valley Girl. And she goes, trust me, this guy's got it. So if you were a Nicolas Cage fan, as I am, thank you, Martha Coolidge. So while she made a lot of her debuts in comedy, her real debut was a film that was based on her assault by an acquaintance when she was a teenager. And she actually went on when she was, later in her career to make more serious films like Ramble and Rose. And she also still makes films as well, but the movie that ended up kind of sinking her career was Angie with Gina Davis. And it's another one where it's really sad to look at someone who has an established body of work just undone by one picture. So moving on to Katherine Bigelow, best known as being the only woman in 91 years to win an Oscar for directing. Pretty sure, again, personal opinion, I think there's at least a few other women who should have won in those 91 years, but she's the one. And I think since she won, I think there's been only one other woman nominated for Best Director. It's almost as if the Oscars are like, Okay, we did it. We gave a lady an Oscar. We're good, right? Joking aside, she was only the fourth woman to be nominated, and that was for The Hurt Locker in 2009. And her first film was The Loveless, and she made two other genre classics. So Near Dark, if you're a horror fan, is a vampire film, and Point Break is an action classic. And like a lot of women we've covered so far, they kind of avoid making, I would say, like the stereotypical women's films. They don't make the quote unquote chick flicks. So I see that from what I've read from a lot of women in interviews, they don't want to be pigeonholed into one thing. And it's very understandable, as once you are put in a certain box in Hollywood, it can be very hard to break out. So we're moving to Hong Kong. I just wanted to highlight Clara Law. She got a little bit of exposure here in the late 80s, early 90s. So if you're familiar with Hong Kong cinema, you're probably most familiar with the name Wong Kar-wai. But Clara Law, kind of like Gillian Anderson, not Gillian Anderson, I'm sorry. Jillian Armstrong was the woman to break out of the Aussie film explosion. Clara Law was the woman to break out of the Hong Kong cinema explosion in the late 80s. So her debut was The Other Half, and The Other Half in 1988. And Floating Life was the film that got her a lot of international exposure. And she lives in Australia, so a lot of her films kind of deal with the Chinese diaspora, the idea of, we don't technically live in the quote unquote homeland. Unfortunately, it's hard to find some of her films beyond Floating Life, but I would highly recommend checking that one out. She's a filmmaker I wish still had, I think, the exposure she had back in the day. So we're going on to Oozen Palsy. So she is the first Black woman to direct a feature produced by a major studio. That was A Dry White Season by MGM, and that was in 1989. So if you watched my Black filmmakers last month, I talked about how long it took for Black filmmakers to really kind of break into the system. And it took Black women even longer to do so. She made her debut in 1983, luckily she had a fan base of very influential people. Robert Redford was an early fan, and her other big fan was Marlon Brando. And he was so moved by her work, he came out of semi-retirement to act in A Dry White Season. And she was also the first Black director to win a César and a Silver Lion, which, again, a great accomplishment. But if you look at it in in 1989, how long have films been made? That's almost 100 years at that point. So moving on to Claire Denis, she is a French filmmaker. France, I would say, probably has the most wide variety of female filmmakers other than the United States. She's an interesting one because she's so across the map in terms of what genre she'll work in. And she also has an interesting backstory. So her father was a colonial administrator. France had a lot of colonies on the African continent. So colonialism is something that she's explored in films. Her debut, Chocolat, not the romantic comedy about chocolate. This was, again, about colonialism in 1988 in the superb White Material, which stars Isabelle Huppert, and that came out in 2009. She is someone who could absolutely be described as not quite a journeyman director, but definitely someone who isn't nailed down to one genre. She has done sci-fi, she's done romantic films, she's done slice of life, she's done political. She's really someone who you cannot fit her into one box. And if you do like films that happen to be more stylized, Claire Denis is someone for you. If you saw her English language debut, High Life, which came out a few years ago with Robert Pattinson, that is a full scale, almost a sensory experience. She's actually, if I could compare her to any director, I might compare her to Michael Glazer in the United States in terms of someone who likes to utilize sound and music as much as they like to utilize visuals. And she is still working, she is still putting out films, and I would contend that she is one of our greatest living directors. So moving on to Mira Nair, she is an Indian filmmaker and probably the most well-known Indian filmmaker in the United States. She made her debut, Salam Bombay, which was nominated for an Oscar. Her US debut was Mississippi Marsala, which not quite the launch point for Denzel Washington, but definitely got him right as he was getting really popular. And Mississippi Marsala is a film where you think it's going to be a romantic comedy based on the name. It's actually more of a drama that deals with both, you know, cross-culture romance, but also with diaspora and the feelings of trying to find home. The inciting incident of Mississippi Marsala is an Indian family is forced to leave. I'm blank. Idi Amin, I believe it was. I really hope I'm not messing this name up. I'm sorry, everyone. I'm an international affairs major. I should know this, but Uganda, when Idi Amin had anyone who was of Asian descent leave the country in their third generation family. So it's them going to the United States and trying to find a home there, and also how the trauma of being ejected from the place you considered your home, the effect that that has on your family. Really good film. I'm sad that that one isn't more available. I think I watched that when I was in college. But her most famous film is Monsoon Wedding, that won a Golden Lion. Monsoon Wedding is just such a wonderful, joyful film. And it's also, if you are a fan of Bollywood, so Bollywood is not all Indian cinema. It's a subsection of Indian cinema, but Monsoon Wedding plays with so many Bollywood tropes. Like, it plays with the wet sari scene, it plays with the dance scene. It is a wonderful, joyful film. If you've never seen it, highly recommend it. She is still making films as well. Her most recent movie, I believe, was Queen of Katwe, which was a Disney film, but a very well-directed Disney film. Moving on to Jane Campion, I believe she was the second, or I think she was the second woman to be nominated for an Oscar in 1994. So that was almost 20-year gap between nominations. So her film, The Piano, was the one that garnered her all of the nominations and a ton of acclaim. She was the second woman nominated for an Oscar in directing and did win Best Original Screenplay. And she was the first female director to win the Palme d'Or at Cannes. She's someone who has transitioned to television. She recently made Top of the Lake with Elizabeth Moss. If you're a fan of her, that's a great little series. She just kind of, as she put it in this quote, the clever people used to do film, now they do TV. My hunch is that has to do a lot with the studios are more focused on making films for the international market, and smaller dramas don't sell the same way as a superhero movie. So moving on to Julie Dash, I discussed her last month when I talked about Black filmmakers as kind of both a success story and a casualty of the rise of independent cinema, but the immediate kind of commodification of the independent cinema scene. So her debut was Daughters in the Dust, and she really did not make another feature film after that. So it was discussed in an article that talked about Black cinema that, she makes Daughters of the Dust, which is it's an acclaimed at the time of release. It's not as if it was ignored, but she still couldn't get funding for another feature. Whereas the author brought up someone like Richard Linklater, a filmmaker I do like. He's immediately able to get funding for more features. So the idea of who Hollywood thought was a safer investment, it really unfortunately shows here that they would consider a Black woman who makes films about Black women to just not be a good investment. Time has time has fortunately been on her favor, where Daughters of the Dust is seen as a great piece of American cinema, one of the best films made by a Black director, and seen as kind of an unheralded classic. She still has continued to work in music videos. She's worked in television, and she has provided a lot of guidance for other women who are kind of up and coming in the film industry. I do hope that now, with sort of the renewed attention on her and Daughters in the Dust, we will maybe see another feature from her. So Probably one of the more famous names on here, Nora Ephron. She's not as famous as a director, but her work, her writing work is really what put her on the map. So she wrote Silkwood. She wrote When Harry Met Sally, the beloved film directed by Rob Reiner. And then she made Sleepless in Seattle. So she has been nominated for multiple screenplay Oscars, never directing, but she was the person who kind of, I would say, made the romantic comedy okay for women again, because for a while, I think a lot of female directors really resisted. They didn't want to be put in the romantic comedy box because they figured we'll just stay there or it's just not taken seriously. Whereas Nora Ephron comes and kind of does that. And it's like, oh, we can do this. So she paves the way, for women like Nancy Meyers to, have her career and make, fun films like Something's Gotta Give. And I like to think that because of her, we have, fun little movies like Mamma Mia. Unfortunately, Nora Ephron isn't with us anymore, but, we still have her books, we still have her movies, and her mark on cinema is there. Sorry. Moving on to Kelly Reichardt, another woman who had like just a gap in terms of her debut and her follow-up. So she is definitely would go into the minimalist filmmaking category, definitely kind of the stripped down, although not as precise of a setting as Chantal Ackerman. If I had to kind of give a comparison, if anyone recently saw Nomadland, Kelly Reichardt is kind of in line with what Chloe Zhao is doing in that film. So she made her debut in 1994 with River of Grass, but kind of like Julie Dash, she had a lot of acclaim, but she couldn't raise money for a second feature. She eventually was able to make more films and very well acclaimed films. Wendy and Lucy in 2008 is fantastic. Meek's Cutoff, Certain Women. She works with Michelle Williams a lot. So if you're a fan of Michelle Williams, I would definitely check out these features. And she also edits her own movies. There are some filmmakers who do not do that, but she is someone who she feels she knows what she wants her story to be from the jump. And her most recent film was last year's First Cow, which is a charming little movie, and I would highly recommend watching it. So we're moving to probably one of the most prominent directors in the Arab world, which is Mufida Titali. She's a Tunisian director and the first Tunisian filmmaker to really reach kind of international stardom. So her debut was 1994's Silences of the Palace, and that was actually based on her mother's life. Her mother was a house servant for a prince, and she used a lot of the stories that she had to kind of create her film. She didn't make too many movies after that, but her debut had a lot of acclaim. And she actually she worked in film since the 1970s as an editor. And she says here, quote, traditionally in the Arab film world, a girl works in continuity or as an editor. I never thought of making films. And I find that to be an interesting quote because I think, at first thought, a lot of us would think, oh, women aren't just allowed to be in the filmmaking process at all in the Arab world. But finding out that it's like, oh, they are, they just, again, they're kind of gate kept in those roles. She actually passed away this year on February 7th at the age of 73. Moving on to Cassie Lemons. If she looks familiar, you might have seen her in movies like Hard Target, Silence of the Lambs. She recently directed 2019's Harriet, starring Cynthia Erivo. But her debut is very well regarded. Eve's Bayou in 1997. I believe Roger Ebert, he definitely put that on his top 10 list. Might have even put it as his best of the year. And that is an all-Black Southern Gothic drama. And I was reading an interview in The Believer, and she just said, I wanted to make a film not only about Black people, not only starring Black people, but it wasn't about trauma. It was just simply a story that happened to have Black people rather than relating to, slavery. If you have never seen Eve's Bayou, it's a really good film. I think that might be unfortunately out of print. Also a very different role for Samuel Jackson. And if you're a fan of the actress Journey Smollett, not her brother, we don't talk about Jussie, but Journey Smollett, this is her debut. I believe she was only like 13, 14 years old when she made this. And like another filmmaker we're going to talk about, well, and a couple of women have already kind of done this. She uses her knowledge and influence to help other Black and female filmmakers and kind of keep the door open for them. Mainly because she knows from experience how hard it is to kind of break into the scene. And I like that quote where she said, she goes, I think when people are looking for directors, they often look for people that remind them of themselves. So many of the gatekeepers, again, the gatekeepers in Hollywood, I'm not even talking about the directors, I'm talking more about the studio execs. They, for the most part, see a director as, you know, a white guy, a Martin Scorsese type. No offense to Martin Scorsese, I love him, but that's what people still think of when they think of a director rather than just a person who makes a movie. And so she says, people think director, they think white man. And I think that takes a long time to change. And that's why she's using a lot of the influence she has. Like she'll try to hire women. She'll try to give them director assistant positions to kind of help them break in because she knows it's a little tougher. So moving on to the Wachowski sisters. I always like to say they saved hard sci-fi back in 1999 with The Matrix. If you were a sci-fi fan, sci-fi in the 90s had gotten a little, not goofy, but definitely more, you know, we had stuff like Independence Day, we had stuff like The Fifth Element, but there wasn't any more like hard sci-fi. I think the closest we got was something like Dark City. And they also popularized with The Matrix the cyberpunk look. And obviously we know The Matrix became a franchise. Not a fan of the other two films, but they went on to make more like really high concept pictures, like Cloud Atlas, adapting that work. And that's an almost 3-hour long film. Or directing Speed Racer and making like a candy colored, cartoon land. They are also the most visible trans directors. And prior to their transition, if you were like around and paying attention to this stuff when you were young and like the aughts, they were very private. And I kind of remember seeing, the few times you see them interviewed, they just seem to not want to be there. And one of the things I've noticed since they've both transitioned, they both just seem so much happier. Lana transitioned in 2008 and made her first public appearance in 2012 to promote Cloud Atlas. And Lily came out in 2016 through more unfortunate circumstances. A Daily Mail reporter had threatened to out her, and so she just came out on her own. Lana Wachowski is directing The Matrix 4, whereas Lily is working on a Showtime series called Work in Progress. And hopefully, they won't be the only visible trans directors. More will follow. So going to Japan for a bit, I do want to highlight Naomi Kawase. She is Japan's, as of right now, most prominent working female director. That is an industry that still deals with a lot of sexism and a lot of gatekeeping. She is someone who still managed to make highly acclaimed work, both nationally and internationally. Her film, The Morning Forest, won the Grand Prix at Cannes, and whenever the Olympics happen, she was selected by the IOC to film the 2020 Olympics. She likes to utilize a lot of amateur actors a lot. And we do have her film Sweet Bean at the library. So if you'd like to check that out, we do have some of her work here. Mm-hmm. So moving on to Lynn Ramsey, she's a Scottish filmmaker known for Ratcatcher, and probably most well known for the film we need to talk about, Kevin, which is, it's really hard to describe that film. It's described as a drama. It's also in some ways a horror movie. It's like Rosemary's Baby, but with a child that just inflicts violence at a school. A very unsettling film. And she is some kind of like Claire Dennis. She likes to work with sound. She likes to work with not just visuals. She likes to make the film almost an immersive experience. And she, in some ways, likes to eschew dialogue. And if you've seen the Joaquin Phoenix picture, You Were Never Really Here. That is a film where she does a lot of work, with Joaquin Phoenix, but they work together to create a character who doesn't say a lot, but expresses a lot. And I think she is a filmmaker that she gets some of the best nonverbal performances out of actors. So probably one of the most famous names on this list is Sofia Coppola, who is, obviously Francis Ford Coppola's daughter. Contrary to popular belief, she did not initially want to get into filmmaking. It was something she kind of fell into when she was younger. She grew up around it and she kind of rejected that. Also, contrary to popular belief, she was not the first choice for Michael Corleone's daughter in The Godfather 3. They actually had a whole slew of actresses they wanted, and either it didn't work for timing or they didn't want the part. So she ended up getting that role, and the rest is history. Let's just say she realized acting wasn't her thing, and she said as such. So she made her debut in 1999 with The Virgin Suicides, which met with pretty much like widespread 100% on Rotten Tomatoes level of acclaim. And then with her follow-up, Lost in Translation, she won the Oscar for Best Original Screenplay. And in 2017 with The Beguiled, she became the best director at Cannes to win Best Director. The first woman at Cannes to win for Best Director. So I make a note here that she is a decidedly feminine filmmaker. And as you've been kind of hearing me talk about a lot of these women directors, a lot of them don't like to make, I would say, traditionally feminine films, whereas her movies, if you look at it, there's soft lenses, there's a lot of pink. She likes to do costuming. She likes to focus on some of these softer aspects of a woman's life. It's still from a woman's perspective, but she's someone who embraces the feminine, where in some cases, in an attempt to not be pigeonholed, a lot of directors kind of push that away. And I would recommend all of her movies. I think she's a fantastic director in her own right, aside from her father's last name. So moving on to Gina Prince Bythewood, she was one of the few Black women directing in the early aughts. I believe it was, in terms of mainstream films, it was just her and Cassie Lemons. Kind of similar to that, just no women directors at all in the 30s to 40s. Her made her debut with Love and Basketball in the year 2000, and she likes to bust stereotypes both about what Black movies can be and what movies starring women can be. And last year, she made her action debut with The Old Guard, which is a Charlize Theron film. And one of the things that she really liked about making it was it kind of busted that trope that the female character needed to go through like a hard or traumatic event to be tough. Just something she said that she had seen in a lot of action films written and directed by men, whereas she goes, no, Charlize Theron's character is just tough because she needs to be tough for the situation. Moving on to one of my personal favorite directors, Karen Kusama. And her backstory as to how she got into film was interesting. So she gets her BFA at film from Tisch. And she gets her start as an assistant for John Sayles. John Sayles, who made films like Matawan, Brother from Another Planet, very accomplished director in his own right, mainly on the independent scene. So she wants to make films and he helps fund her film Girl Fight. Mainly, she just kind of sold him on like, this is what I want to do for my debut. And he goes, yeah, sure, I'll help you out. Unfortunately, her follow-up to that was Aeon Flux, which the less said about that, the better. And 2009, she teamed up with Diablo Cody to make Jennifer's Body, which was due to bad marketing. And I just think the culture kind of dismissing Megan Fox at the time, really not well received. Thankfully, that film has been kind of vindicated by history and is now a cult classic. And while she pretty much contends that, again, she's not, tied to one genre, she recently made the drama Destroyer with Nicole Kidman. She has kind of returned to horror again and again. She's directed a segment in the anthology series Double X. She directed The Invitation, which is on Netflix. And if you've not seen it, it is fantastic. And she's going to have a Dracula adaptation, which I can't wait for. Again, she is a director who I think almost fell into that trap of she made a small independent feature. She made a big budget film that the studio kind of just took away from her, but thankfully she landed on her feet. Whereas sometimes if your second feature doesn't do well, that's it. So we're going to a South American filmmaker, probably one of the most prominent South American filmmakers, Lucretia Martell. She's also openly gay, which for Argentina is still kind of a taboo. And she was inspired by another female Argentinian director, Maria Luisa Bergman. South America, this is something where I will just admit it's kind of a blind spot in film, but South America does have a lot of women directing there. It's a place where we think that women, women just don't direct. There's, I would say, more than we think. She made her debut in with The Swamp in 2001, and she uses her films to explore the patriarchy, sexual politics, gender politics. She'll critique class. And she has 3 films, which is The Swamp, The Holy Girl, and The Headless Woman, and they all focus on female perspectives. Her most recent film was Zama, which deals with colonialism. She is a cancer survivor, and that unfortunately kind of put a little bit of a halt in her work, but she is still with us and still working, thankfully. Moving to Germany with Maren Ade. If you've heard of a film, Toni Erdmann, she is the woman who directed it. She's probably the most famous German woman director out right now, mainly because Toni Erdmann had such a high profile and was nominated for Oscars. Her debut, Forest for the Trees, was actually a student film that she made, but it ended up screening at a lot of festivals because teachers and people thought very highly of it. And she received the Silver Bear at the Berlin Film Festival for Everyone Else. And Toni Erdmann, as I mentioned, was a big international hit, and it won Best European Film at the European Film Awards. And she was it was the first film directed by a woman to win that award in 29 years. So moving on to another favorite of mine, Céline Sciamma. So she is a French feminist filmmaker, and I put that in there because there are a lot of directors who will be like, I don't use the label feminist. Jane Campion has kind of go like, I don't use that label. Katherine Brelia said, I'm a feminist, but I study my politics in my films rather than in public. She is very just openly like, nope, feminist, and all my films are too. She's actually a founding member of the 50-50 by 2020, which is a French group to address gender inequality in filmmaking, kind of similar to like Time's Up in the United States. And like Lucretia Martell, she'll tackle gender, sexual identity, patriarchy, and the male gaze in her films. Her recent movie, Portrait of a Lady on Fire, one of the big things people made about it was like, there's almost no men in this movie. It's all just women being around each other. And she kind of said the fact that people consider that to be such a, a groundbreaking thing. She goes, it's, she said it was a little sad, but she also said that's what she was going for, because filmmaking is still, for the most part, dominated by men as a storytelling. So even films directed by women will usually have men in it, versus she's like, nope, I'm Portrait of a Lady on Fire, it's all ladies. And Portrait of a Lady on Fire is a wonderful film. That's the one that really brought her a lot of international attention. And I believe she actually just made a film during the pandemic, just putting us all to shame in terms of productivity. So Patty Jenkins, we're getting kind of into the aughts, so winding down, but Patty Jenkins is the first woman to direct a superhero blockbuster, and is Wonder Woman 2017 is the highest grossing film directed by a woman. You might jump in with what about Captain Marvel? And technically, yes, Captain Marvel was directed by a male-female duo, whereas Wonder Woman was directed solely by Patty Jenkins. So I would just say I give the edge to Patty. And just the fact that she held out for a higher salary for Wonder Woman 84, whereas in a lot of cases, women who directed franchise films or the first one were kind of replaced. She really leveraged the fact that it made a lot of money, the fact that her direction was praised. It's like, no, you need me to make the other one. And she ended up, again, getting more money. She's directing Wonder Woman 3. And it's, if anything, I just see this as a signal of a change in Hollywood, where I think 10, 15 years ago, holding out for more money would have gotten her promptly replaced. Whereas now, at the very least, they're valuing her as a director. So on to Ava DuVernay, which, I mean, where do you begin with Ava DuVernay? She is an incredibly, if you follow her career, an incredibly prolific creative. She's making film, she's making television. Her first film was in 2010. Roger Ebert was a big booster of that work, and that probably helped her get funding for her second feature. And that won a directing prize at Sundance, which again, 2012, the first Black woman to do so. She gets international attention with Selma in 2014, and her documentary 13th is nominated for an Oscar in 2016. She directed A Wrinkle in Time, making her the first Black woman to direct a film that cost over $100 million. And I believe she's going to direct a DC film next. She directed the fantastic When They See Us for Netflix. And as the executive producer for Queen Sugar, she makes a point to have female filmmakers and hire women in production. Like Cassie Lemons and like Julie Dash, she is someone who is particularly devoted to the idea of holding the door open for other women to get their foot in rather than just slamming the door behind. And again, just she's so prolific, it puts me to shame. Up next, we have Dee Reese. Some of this, if you were at last month's program, I talked about her. She actually worked for Spike Lee on films like Inside Man. And her debut, Pariah, garnered a lot of acclaim. It was really heralded as like one of the best films in sort of the, not just about Black women, but a great film in sort of the queer cinema genre as well. And there was a shout out from Meryl Streep. I don't know, I can't remember if it was at the Oscars or the Globes, but Meryl Streep, shouted out the movie as one of the best movies of the year, and said, basically said Dee Reese is like a great rising star and we should all look out for her. And I'm like, well, that's some great word of mouth. And she is, a lesbian herself. So she explores the intersection of race, gender, and sexual identity in her films. So Pariah, she does that. Her follow-up, Mudbound, received multiple Oscar nominations. And again, she was the first Black woman nominated for Best Adapted Screenplay. In 2017, you have that goodness and that, oh, only the first? And like DuVernay, she tries to hire as many women as possible on her productions. So going back to the Arab world, specifically Saudi Arabia, we have Haifa Al-Mansour. She directed Wajija in 2012, and that was the first film shot entirely in Saudi Arabia and the first full-length film made by a Saudi woman. And it actually took 5 years to make, mainly because she spent a lot of time getting the funding and the permission to make it. And so she makes features in Saudi Arabia. She also makes films abroad as well, mainly because making films abroad is a little bit easier. But again, it is great to see that in all areas of the world, women are starting to break these barriers. And sometimes it may seem like it's a little too late, but it's better than nothing. Okay, moving on, Eliza Hittman. She's an independent filmmaker. She made last year's Never, Rarely, Sometimes, Always. And she likes to touch on the adolescent experience without moralizing. She doesn't like to sensationalize it. I would say it's like Fast Times at Ridgemont High, only without the laughs. Never, Rarely, Sometimes, Always won the Silver Bear Prize at the Berlin Film Festival. It was actually my favorite film of last year. We do have it at the library if you'd like to watch it. And it's a film that deals, like, the plot of that film is a young woman in rural Pennsylvania who is trying to get an abortion, has to go all the way to New York with her cousin, can't tell her family for reasons. And she talks about why she chose to do that as a feature film rather than a documentary. And she says, quote, "There are stigmas around representing female issues and experiences in the context of a fictional narrative film. Documentaries are presenting information about topics people don't know, and that's the medium to explore, issues. Women's stories are less represented on screen, so they're seen as more niche." And she tries to change that with the films that she makes. Moving on to Jennifer Kent. I'm like, oh no, I have 10 minutes left. She's an Australian filmmaker, probably the most prominent woman to come out of Australia since Jillian Armstrong. So she had her debut with The Babadook, which was both a horror hit and had mainstream acclaim. But rather than follow it up with just a horror feature, she decided to follow up with The Nightingale, which focuses on both the violence of an assault against a woman, but also ties it into the violence of colonialism. So similar to how Claire Dennis will talk about colonialism in her work, it seems that Jennifer Kent is going that area as well. And she was inspired to direct by Lars von Trier's Dancer in the Dark, which I don't know why that would inspire you to do anything other than cry, but more power to her. So moving on to Chloe Zhao, who I mentioned earlier with Nomadland, who recently became the first Asian American woman to win Best Director, I think at any major awards show for Nomadland. So she's also a Mount Holyoke alum, as someone from Western Mass. That makes me proud. She was born in Beijing, but she moved to the United States as a teen. Her film The Rider is what brought her a lot of national acclaim, and like a lot of other some of the other directors I've mentioned, like Kawase, she likes to cast non-actors. If you've seen Nomadland, Frances McDormand and David Strathairn are pretty much the only professional actors in that film. So as I mentioned, she just won the Golden Globe for Best Director, and I look at this and I think of what Marion E. Wong, you know, how her directorial debut really didn't work out for her. But maybe, you know, I kind of wonder what she would think if she'd known about 100 or so years later, an Asian American woman would finally get the acclaim that she, you know, evaded her. So moving on to Denise Gomez Erguven. She is a Turkish filmmaker. She was raised in France. She made her debut with 2015's Mustang, which is a fantastic feature. That is about 5 girls who they live in a small town in Turkey. They're playing with some boys in a lake, and it all of a sudden becomes a scandal due to a gossipy neighbor. And when I look at that film, I wonder how it would have been played out if it was made by an American versus if someone closer to the culture had made it. And she makes it less about, I could just see becoming a stereotypical film about, like, you know, Islamic cultures repressing women. She doesn't go that route. She makes it more about just, in some cases, Turkey as a whole, where Turkey is going. It's almost regressing in terms of its social progress, and also focusing on just how powerful gossip and you know, being under a microscope in a small town can be. And I like that quote that she has. She goes, "Women in society have been represented by, you know, men most of the time in film." So that's why she felt that it was so important for her to tell the story of Mustang. So rounding it out, we have 2 more. We have Greta Gerwig, the 5th woman to be nominated for an Oscar in directing, for Lady Bird in 2017. She started to get fame in 2012 when she wrote Frances Ha with her husband Noah Baumbach. And Lady Bird was her solo directorial debut. It was about universally acclaimed. And then she made Little Women last year. Oh no, it was 2019. Sorry, time moves quickly. She made Little Women in 2019. It seems that she is just one of the many up and coming female directors. But I would like to finish with pointing out Rungano Nyoni, who is a Zambian-born filmmaker who made the film I Am Not a Witch, which talks not only about sort of superstition in societies, but how misogyny can manifest itself in different ways, and in a small community thinking a girl is a witch, but also kind of trying to draw some parallels to, you know, how it manifests itself in more modern societies. She was educated in Wales and wanted to become an actress, but she found a love of directing and enrolled in school in London. She got her start making short films, and for I Am Not a Witch, she won a BAFTA for an outstanding debut. And again, just looking at how many amazing women are coming out and making films all over the globe, I think this is just a good, just remembering this is only a sample of women making films is kind of makes me happy as someone who watches movies. So just a quick to look at some rising stars. Madi Diop for Atlantics, Kitty Green for last year's The Assistant, Nia DaCosta for Little Woods, who is her horror debut, Candyman, will hopefully be out this year. I've been waiting for that one. Lulu Wang for The Farewell, and Maimouna Doucouré, who had some, her film Cuties or Mignons in France, had a lot of controversy in the United States thanks to a very, very ill decided poster that Netflix chose. And there were actually a lot of women who, female directors, including Cassie Lemons, Julie Dash, Lizzie Borden, Deborah Granick, who directed Leave No Trace. They all signed a letter in solidarity supporting her, basically because she got a lot of criticism, basically because someone at Netflix designed a horrible poster, she got death threats. And it was nice to see a lot of women in the filmmaking community come to her defense and say, no, we support her. And, you know, I would just say, as someone who did watch the movie, that poster is a horrific misrepresentation of the film she was making. So quick little sidetrack. You probably wondered, considering I'm a horror fan, where were all the horror directors? That is going to be its own program later this year. So keep your eyes peeled for October. We are going to talk about women like Anna Biller, Mary Herron, the Soska sisters, and some great female directed horror from around the world. And I'm going to end this with just other directors that you can look for if you'd like. Alrighty. And with that, oh darn, I stopped sharing the screen. Sorry. Well, does anyone have any question? We have about like 3 minutes. Again, one of my, I have to really, kick myself, because I really thought I could do this all in one program. And now I'm like, no, this really should have been like 2. But does anyone have any questions or recommendations?
Liz, I just wanted to ask, what was the Elizabeth Moss series that you mentioned by
Top of the Lake. Top of the Lake.
Top of the Lake, okay.
I am actually, Liz, there is a great female directed film starring Elizabeth Moss that came out last year. It's called Shirley. It is on Hulu, and it's directed by Josephine Decker. One of my favorites of last year. Elizabeth Moss is just one of my favorite working actresses. I think she's fantastic.
And also, I just wondered personally, do you ever think about dabbling in film in terms of directing, writing?
Oh, I don't know how creative I am, honestly. I think I prefer the more analytical side.
Yeah.
We have had, my partner and I have had we had basically, long story short, an idea for a comedic Purge short, where it's, the series for the Purge is like crime is legal for 12 hours. But we thought our idea for the film would be a bunch of film nerds going to the Criterion section of Barnes and Noble and trying to get all of the like $40 Blu-rays they can while crime is legal. That's about as far as I've gone. I tend to be more of the, I can do a lot of panels on it, but I'm not sure what I could do behind the camera.
Mm-hmm.
They do say those who can't do teach.
Well, thank you. That you definitely did extremely well. So thank you.
I know there's, again, this is it made me happy to see that there were so many more people than I thought I would really cover. I'm like, oh, hey, this is great.
Thank you, Liz. It was wonderful.
Yes.
Again, I would say, if I do just want to give a quick plug for the Criterion Collection. They are releasing one of Dorothy Arzner's films in May, and in the same month they are releasing a new edition of Fast Times at Ridgemont High. So
wow.
if you are a film fan, I would just say go to their website, because they have done a lot of work to try to include not only female directors, but they have been working to expand the canon in terms of who they include. So they're getting a lot more directors from Africa. They're trying to get a lot more directors from South America, but they have been doing a lot to highlight women in film.
And you said some of them are available. You can sort of search them out, but some even on YouTube or?
Yeah, free and full on YouTube. I always say take advantage of it. A lot of streaming sites have at least some of their work. Unfortunately, the silent film era is the stuff that is just not there.
Yeah.
All right. Well, thank you all for coming tonight. I have like 2 minutes to close up.
Close
So
up.
thank you everyone for coming. And Todd, I will see you in about 20 minutes. Have a good night, everyone.
Thank you. You
Thanks,
too.
Liz.
Bye.
Take care.